Hello there and welcome to our L24 special coverage over the Ukraine-Russia war, the so-called special military operation, and a diplomatic show of support for Ukraine. The leaders of France, Italy and Germany, all members of the European Union, arrived in Kyiv on Thursday morning. French President Emmanuel Macron said the leaders brought a message of unity. On the other hand, Lugansk region is being attacked from 9 directions simultaneously, Ukraine's top general said. Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of Security Council of Russia, has posted yesterday morning to Telegram. In his post, Medvedev questions a Ukrainian request that it receive energy imports this winter with an option to delay payment for 2 years. Medvedev says, just a question. Who said that in 2 years Ukraine will even exist on the world map? A question raised attention over a survey that was made between 9 EU member states. Found support for Ukraine remain high, but those worries have shifted to the conflict's wider impacts. The survey found that despite strong support across Europe for Ukraine's bid to join EU and the West's policy of cutting ties with Moscow, many voters in Europe want the war to end as soon as possible, even if it means Ukraine losing territory. To analyze all this information, I'm joined live by Skype platform by Mr. Heinrich Flenga, Vice Chairman of the Schiller Institute from Germany, and John Phoenix, international relations expert from England. Gentlemen, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to this debate. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into our discussion, let's read for you this piece of information. French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and Italian Premier Mario Draghi arrived in Kiev Thursday. Europeans are meeting with Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky as they prepare for a key European Union leaders summit in Brussels next week and June a NATO summit in Madrid.
We have all seen these images of devastated city, which is at once an heroic city since it's here. Among other things, that the Ukrainian arrested the Russian army that was descending on Kiev. So we have to imagine the heroism of this army, but also of the Ukrainian population.
Mr. Halley, I'll be starting with you since Germany is over there and you are in Germany. How can you explain this visit by the Western leaders to Kiev at this precise time, and why U.S. President yet he didn't and he couldn't manage to do the same?
I think the reason Olaf Scholz is there is because of intense pressure from the United States on Germany. For many intents and purposes, Germany is still an occupied country. When the U.S. says jump, the Germans say how high. Now, with that said, though, there's another aspect to this meeting with Macron, Draghi, and Scholz going to Kiev. And that was expressed by the chief advisor to Zelensky, Alexei Arestovich, who said that he's worried that their real message is going to be, you have to negotiate. Because it's clear there are fissures within the European countries, concern about the economy, concern about a bigger war. And I think that there's probably a dual message there, that we'll deliver more weapons, but you have to start preparing an exit strategy. Now, that being said, again, I think Olaf Scholz is betraying Germany. I think this is the wrong policy for Germany. And I think many Germans are getting increasingly nervous about the implications of sending weapons. It was just announced today that Germany will send 3 multiple rocket launchers to Ukraine. And some are saying this makes Germany now a co-belligerent if any of those rockets are used to target sites inside Russia.
Quite understood. Coming to you, Mr. John, as an international expert, what is your read into this visit by the Western leaders to Kiev? Though there are a lot of contradictory aspects within their statements. For instance, the French President Macron stated that Russia should not be humiliated, and yet he is still backing up Ukraine. What role he is playing precisely in this battle?
Well, I think he's indicating to come with the conclusion that should have a win-win, obviously, solution to the situation. We live in Europe. We are really affected so much. I mean, if you don't know, the prices of oil, the petrol in this country now is £2. It never reach 120, 125. We are actually affected as price of food, other services, it's really high to sky. I think the statement by Macron is a very diplomatic statement where we had to negotiate, where both parties had to come out with the agreement, where the Russian will get what they want, the Ukrainian will get what they want, because at the end of the day, the losers of this war is the locals, the civilians of Ukraine, and nobody win in this case. They're going to sit in the end and talk peace, and we are living in the continent where we should actually promote peace and dialogue between the two parties. As my your respected guests mentioned, dumping more of weapons and support of military, it's escalated the situation. It's not going to really end the war. It caused more havoc and more casualty in the war. I think the statement by Macron is wise, but also you have to remember one thing: France got their own interests in this issue, as a European countries, and I think the effect of the economy in France and England, UK, is really severe on the local population. We start feeling it now in terms of the, as I said, the food and petrol and other services. They're cutting on other services now in order to refinance, other services. So we have problem. I thought the sanctions supposed to affect Russia. I think, to be honest with you, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. We are more affected, I believe, at this moment from this sanction. We are more affected. More than Russia. So I think sooner or later we have to talk, and I think the best thing to do is to talk soon rather than later, save more lives and save the economy.
Perfectly understood. In the same line of thought, Mr. Halley, what role Francis Macron is playing in this battle between Russia and Ukraine? I mean, in the very beginning, Macron tried politics and negotiation, yet he didn't succeed. After that, his country joined the deliveries of weapons to Ukraine. And at the same time, he said that Russia should not be humiliated after this battle come to an end. So how can you explain this sort of contradiction?
Well, I think that's typical of Macron. He's playing both sides against the other. He doesn't want to seem to be disloyal to NATO. But look, there's a lot of pressure in France to get out of this, to not be part of it, to get out of NATO. Just 2 days ago, Pierre de Gaulle, the grandson of Charles de Gaulle, issued a statement where he accused Paris of submission to NATO. And he said that there's a disastrous role of NATO, its continuous expansion. He said the West has let Zelensky, his oligarchs, and neo-Nazi military groups lock themselves into a spiral of war. My associates in France tell me there's a great deal of dissatisfaction with the French role. And it's not that they want France to do more, they want France to be pulled out from under NATO. Now, Macron is quite weak. If you look at the elections that just took place in France, he got about 26% of the vote in the first round. That's not exactly a mandate. And I think the same thing is true of Scholz. He doesn't have a mandate. Without the Green support, and by the way, the Greens in Germany have become the biggest warmongers of all. The other question here is, can the damage with Russia be repaired? The Russian economy is weathering this much better than the European economies. And in the future, German business, French business, Italian business depend on increased trade with Russia. But at this point, they're driving Russia completely away from Europe. So I think Macron is digging himself a deep hole that I don't know if he can climb out of.
Very good indeed. Derived from your statements, Mr. John, Europe's unity over the war in Ukraine is at risk as public attention increasingly shifts from the battlefield to cost of living concerns. A survey in 9 EU member states, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Spain, and Sweden, plus the UK, found support for Ukraine remained high, but those worries have shifted to the conflict's wider impacts. I mean, the survey found that despite strong support across Europe for Ukraine's bid to join the EU and the West policy of cutting ties with Moscow, many voters in Europe want the war to end as soon as possible, even if that means Ukraine losing territory. How can you explain this?
Well, as I said earlier, the public in UK now feeling the heat of the economy. They're having a problem with jobs, with salaries. It's really affecting us more than Russia, as my colleague said. I think the Russian economy is prosper more than the British economy at this moment. As I said, the problem is the Europeans is a tail for the American leading NATO war. You know, it is a profit business for the United States. You know, supplying dangerous weapons to Ukraine is only allow Russia to use more dangerous weapons in order to control, in order to win the war. I think the problem is a lot of the British public now, despite of the false information we receive from Western media, especially in this country, the Western, with the British media, and there's a lot of lies about the war. You know, they're misleading the public in the beginning. Now the public feeling the heat of the war. They know that it's not going to be. I mean, keep in mind, Russia is not Libya. You know, it's not Libya to be attacked by NATO. You know, it is something you had to think it twice before you think you're going to win the war. So I think, as I said earlier, we are having difficulties in this country. We have jobs lose, we have a problem with the economy, food, petrols, and name it, you know. So I think the best way, as I said earlier, we should actually isolate ourselves being a tail for the United States, as happened in the war with Iraq, you know. We went to war with Iraq based on lie, because it was an American lie.
Quite understood. We will come to this point. All right, moving on to the second point. NATO defense ministers gathered for a second day in Brussels on Thursday to weigh more military aid for Ukraine. Secretary General John Stoltenberg opened the meeting by setting the agenda, which is to further strengthen European defenses, as he stated.
NATO Defense Ministerial meeting. We will discuss how we can further strengthen our defenses as we face the gravest threat to Euro-Atlantic security in decades. Right now, we have over 40,000 troops under direct NATO command, mostly in the eastern part of the alliance, and many more on high alert, backed by significant air and naval assets. And we have doubled the number of multinational battle groups from the Baltic to the Black Sea. But we need to do even more to keep our people safe now and in the years to come. So today we will prepare the ground for the Madrid summit, where we will make important decisions to keep our alliance strong.
Mr. Harley, Russia's main target behind this military operation was to stop the NATO enlargement eastward Europe. But now Sweden and Finland have applied to join this alliance, and even the Baltic countries dared to close their airspace for the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov to pass through to Serbia last week. I mean, could we say that Russia has failed to reach its decisive goal, which is preventing NATO to be enlarged precisely near the Russian borders?
Well, the issue of Sweden and Finland is not yet determined. The question of Ukraine, I think, is determined. I think there's no way now Ukraine will be allowed into NATO. And in that sense, Putin will have accomplished one of his objectives. But I think the problem when Stoltenberg and others meet and talk about spending more money, they're ignoring the harm and the pain of the people of the European countries. You know, in the United Kingdom, they're now projecting a negative growth rate for the next quarter. Disposable income is dropping. In Germany, 1 out of 6 families are skipping a meal right now because of the cost of food. Inflation is becoming an increasing problem. Now, Biden, of course, blames this on Putin. He's calling it Putin's tax on food and fuel, which is a complete fraud. The inflation is driven by wrong economic policies in the West of pumping huge volumes of liquidity to bail out bankrupt corporations. We're having a conference this weekend, the Schiller Institute, which is titled, "There Can Be No Peace Without Bankruptcy Reorganization of the Dying Transatlantic System." The military policy is, in one sense, covering up the financial crisis, but secondly, it's harming it. Increased military spending does nothing to reduce inflation. As we see, they're sending weapons to Ukraine that are being destroyed the moment they arrive in Ukraine. So what's the purpose of spending the money, other than to bail out the corporations that produce the weapons, who of course support the war? So I think NATO is in a completely wrong course. I don't know that Putin is going to succeed in stopping NATO expansion, but I think there's growing sentiment in France, Germany, and Italy to leave NATO because it's lost its sense of purpose that existed at the end of World War II.
Perfectly understood. This is quite important. Mr. John, how can you explain the NATO moves and the newest application of the Scandinavian countries in this precise time? And what are you saying about what Mr. Hanley has just stated, saying that the bankruptcy of the banks and the economic system of the Western leaders?
I agree 100% with him. I think that's what we actually facing in this country. We're having really now we started having food banks in the streets. You know, as you mentioned about the families in 1 out of the 6 families in Germany, we have kids now can't have breakfast in the morning to go to school. They have a school early morning breakfast because families can afford to feed their kids. It is really a disaster for, you know, and also a wrong policy of NATO. Obviously, especially in this situation. So I think this warmongers, who just was airing a minute ago, head of the NATO General Secretary. I mean, don't forget one thing. Since the beginning of the war, the Ukrainian got nothing from NATO, other than now start supplying them with more deadly weapons to obviously cause death. America will fight this war to the last Ukrainian civilian, not the last American civilian. You know, from day one he was asking for their support. There's no support. This issue started in 2014. What they got in 2014, the only thing they got in 2014 after the American coup against the democratically elected president is that Ms. Nellon, she was obviously the Assistant Secretary of State, American Assistant Secretary of State. She visited the Mayadeen and she offered them biscuits. That's what they got since 2014 till now, a piece of biscuit. And now the NATO is watching Ukraine being burned. So I think, as my colleague said, there is a big effect on the economy, and sooner or later our inflation is going to go very high. And we're having a problem now with the prices of houses, cars, and other services, as I said earlier.
Perfectly understood. So you do agree on the idea that Ukraine has been sacrificed for an already agenda made before?
Yeah.
Understood. Now moving on to another point to be discussed. White House Foreign Affairs spokesman John Kirby claimed that the U.S. President Joe Biden had a long phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, where the U.S. President has announced $1 billion more military aid to Ukraine.
Reiterating, the president had a very good call today with President Zelensky of Ukraine. It was an opportunity for President Zelensky to update President Biden on what's going on the battlefield, on the ground, and to talk to the president about Ukraine's security requirements and capabilities going forward. The president also obviously took this opportunity to inform President Zelensky that we're announcing today, I think you saw, $1 billion in additional security assistance to support Ukraine's armed forces in their brave defense of their country.
We're here today because of our unwavering determination to get Ukraine the capabilities that it urgently needs to defend itself. And I'm personally grateful for the significant security assistance that this contact group has provided thus far.
Mr. Halley, you're an American, so as a direct question, don't you think that U.S. has enough problems to deal with inside its territory? I mean, gun shooting every week, inflation, and yet they keep giving Ukraine these huge amounts of money and weaponry shipments each month, though it means nothing now. Russia is already taking control of the Donbas region.
Well, it's not only a waste of money, it's an example of an extension of the foolish economic policy meeting a foolish strategic policy, which is why we need a new strategic and financial architecture. Look, the United States, for a period of time recently, couldn't even provide baby formula to mothers. And yet we're spending $1 billion here, $6 billion there, $60 billion more. The policy of the United States in recent years has been regime change. And as my colleague mentioned before, regime change in Libya and Iraq, as destructive as it was, is not as costly as trying to do that with Russia. And they're trying to use Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia because they fear that with Russia and China forming an economic alliance, connecting Eurasia with Europe, which is also attractive to German and French business, that the Anglo-Americans may lose out completely on their ability to control the terms of trade and finance. So that's what's really going on. So the $1 billion worth of weapons that just was announced by Biden is not going to change the terms of battle. The Russians are succeeding. It's a long, difficult fight, but they're driving the Ukrainians out of the Donbass, and they're doing it because the Ukrainian army, led by the Azov battalion of neo-Nazis, was killing Russian civilians since 2014, and no one in the West raised a peep about that. The French and the Germans tried to, with the Minsk Accord, to get the Ukrainians to negotiate, but the government of Ukraine, Poroshenko, and then Zelensky refused to negotiate. So we're throwing money down a rat hole, as they sometimes say in the US, spending money for a war that is a terribly destructive war. It's wreaking havoc against people in Ukraine and against Russia. And the boomerang effect of the economic sanctions is now hitting Americans and Europeans. And by the way, just one quick point on that. Sanctions are war crimes. The sanctions being carried out against Syria, the so-called Caesar sanctions, the sanctions against Yemen, against Libya, Iraq, these are war crimes against Afghanistan. They're starving children and denying them medicine. That's the so-called humanitarian policy of the war hawks in the United States.
Very good indeed. Mr. John, it seems now we have a different kind of confrontation. It's all about long-range missiles and the new system weapons. So if Ukraine could have the availability of these weapons, as the Ukrainian president is still pleading for more weapons, would that help Ukraine to win against Russia, which will only buy them a little time? In other words, to prolong this operation, as Putin claimed.
Well, can I just go back for a second just to add something to what my colleague said earlier? You know, it's not our topic today to discuss the American economy. I mean, if you think of the 84 billion Biden provide to Ukraine, I think there's a lot of money needed to release thousands and thousands of refugees on the border between USA and Mexico. You know, if you look at the American media, the independent media, a lot of children dying in these camps. They are actually detention camps, you know. Thousands of Latinos, Mexicans, and other Central and South American who walked all the way to the border have been mistreated. Children dying, no health service to these people at all. You know, building in new jails. I mean, we could go on and on. Obviously, as I said, this is not the right time to discuss it. So I think the 84 billion pounds was sent, and instead of being sent to be aided the Ukrainian to kill more, and the Russian obviously belonging the war. I think they should be a way where the Americans change their policies. As the colleague said here, the American regime change, which is Syria, as I mentioned, Syria obviously was one of the biggest victims on that war. You know, America is still occupying part of Syria and stealing their oil. When they left Afghanistan, they stole their money, and the kids in Afghanistan starving because the Americans actually deprived the country with their own money. So we need to look at the big lies where the Americans saying, well, the human right, the human right of the Ukrainians, the Russians. Well, look at the millions they spent in Saudi Arabia bombing and killing Yemenis and bombing schools and hospitals. America never engaged in such wars for anything so-called human rights. This is a big lie, but this is a marketing for their, obviously, media lies that the involvement in Ukraine because the Russian aggression, you know. And this is, I thought it'd be useful to mention. So people out there should know the motive is not because America suddenly became, Biden became Jesus, because there is a profit in this war, and this is their motive. It's a profit only. This is the nature of capitalism.
Thank you so much, Mr. John. Now, the last point to be discussed briefly. President Xi Jinping on Wednesday assured Vladimir Putin of China's support on Russia's sovereignty and security, leading Washington to warn Beijing. China has refused to condemn the Moscow special military operation in Ukraine and has been accused of providing diplomatic cover for Russia by blasting Western sanctions and arms sales to Kyiv. Mr. Hawley, a couple of minutes left. So briefly, there are a lot of questions that has been raised over the alliance between China and Russia. One of the most important keys to be tackled in between this alliance of the two giants, it says, if Russia's operation in Ukraine ended up with a full succession, this will strongly motivate China to unleash an invasion over Taiwan. What are you saying about this?
I think that's another lie cooked up by the war hawks, who do want to have a war with China. They want to contain China. They want to contain Russia. They'd like to have regime change in both of those countries. And what they fear is that while the West is going through a profound economic systemic collapse, China is growing its economy. China is working with its neighbors, including talking about moving the Belt and Road Initiative into the Middle East to help rebuild Syria and Iraq. So there's two different systems out there. And the Chinese and the Russians are moving toward a coordination. And the idea that the United States is going to, or that China will use Russia's success in Ukraine to attack Taiwan, the Chinese have a long-range approach to Taiwan where they think there can be peaceful reunification maybe in a decade or two. But if you keep sending U.S. warships into the Straits of Taiwan, you could provoke a war. And I think that's what the military establishment and the intelligence community in the United States really wants.
So U.S. is always in the middle. Mr. John, if Russia-China alliance come to the scene directly, will the Anglo-American policy that suffers the economic failure could face this new world order?
Well, you're not talking only about China and obviously Russia. You talk about the Russian, Chinese, Iran, and India. This is obviously an alliance which is threatened the United States, it threatened the dollar. This is obviously influenced the market in the Far East. Losing the American military control, and obviously their control and their strong grip on Middle East oil. So the problem is they are not facing only China; they are facing a new alliance. I'm not mentioning even small countries who will actually support. Obviously Russia and anti-American, but they're scared to say anything. You remember Pakistan as example. Imran Khan refused to condemn the Russians, and he said, "I will stay obviously on the border. I'm not going to involve." They overthrow him. They throw their obviously puppets on the Pakistani military. So this is not only Russia and China, it is also engage Iran and India and Brazil to that effect, which is still trading with Russia.
Quite understood. So directly, Mr. Hawley, talking about the food problem in the world, Luca Russo, who works as an analyst for food crisis within the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, he said that we need to clarify that today there is no global food shortage. Food is available. To give you a number, each year the world produces about 780 million metric tons of wheat, and the shortage for this year is only 3 million. So how is Ukraine crisis threatening food supply?
Well, it's not. It's the way the global cartels market grain, and they're looking for higher prices. They're trying to blame it on Russia and Ukraine. The Russians and the Turkish government just had a discussion about how to break the blockade. And while people are blaming Putin, it's the Ukrainians who mined the harbors and have not yet taken the mines out of the harbors that have stopped the shipments. If the U.S. is worried about starvation, as my colleague just said, why are they still withholding funds that are legitimate funds of the Afghan government when there are millions of young children in Afghanistan facing starvation? So again, it's hypocrisy. We can produce enough. The question is, the emergence in the global south, along with Russia and China, for a new potential financial system is what threatens the City of London and Wall Street. And that's why they're trying to get a regime change in Russia to shortcut this potential of a fundamental change. Instead, why doesn't the United States join them? Why not have peaceful cooperation of the great powers of the world, including the BRICS nations and the Western countries?
Quite understood. Mr. John Phoenix, so as a word to end this show, how can you explain this crisis and grain shortages and why they are all pointing finger to Russia? Briefly, please.
I don't think even the crisis exists. This is actually a management crisis. They manage this crisis. I mean, suddenly you're telling me that oil, which went up to 2 pounds a liter, that there's a shortage in the market. They have a storage it's full of oil. They have a storage full of food. But this is a marketing trick where you can make money after crisis. That is the whole aim. That you raise the prices. He said, well, let's blame Russia. You have to have somebody to blame. And always, in every war, you have a blame game, which is, in this case, is people are starving now because of Russia, not because the Western companies who actually want to make millions and millions out of this crisis.
Perfect. Mr. John Phoenix from England, Mr. Heinrich Lange from Germany, thank you ever so much for being with us in this show. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here with us on L24 News. Bye for now. Bye-bye.